The film Society of the Snow is a film of Hannibal survivors based on a true story in 1972. It begins by showing a student rugby team from the city of Montevideo in Uruguay playing in an interclub match. One of the teams agreed to go on vacation together to Chile, and they agreed to take a vacation by inviting their respective family members. This trip will be taken by renting a commercial aircraft with 45 passengers with a flight route from the city of Montevideo, Uruguay to the city of Santiago, Chile. On the plane, they were very happy because some of the passengers were on vacation for the first time to another country, and they all joked to relieve boredom. However, when passing the Andes Mountains on the border of Chile, there was turbulence on the plane, so a co-pilot instructed passengers to move from the back seat to the front seat with a panicked expression. The shaking became stronger, making passengers lose their sense of humor, turning into a tense atmosphere. The pilot tried to keep going so that the plane could escape from the thick cloud cover, and suddenly, the plane hit a cliff, making it fall apart into two parts. Sometime later, the passengers began to realize the terrible conditions, ranging from minor to serious injuries, and the rest had died. In that panic, the surviving members tried to save other passengers who were injured or crushed by the plane's seats. After that, they went out to check the condition of the ship's pilot, who turned out to be in a dying state, plus the radio communication could not be activated. So the pilot whispered his last will, asking to delete the browser history on his cell phone. That night was a very difficult first night, because with a mentality that was still in shock, they had to struggle to withstand the very dark and cold weather that penetrated the bones inside the wreckage of the plane, trying to close their eyes, hoping that morning would soon arrive. The next morning, some of the passengers who survived the extreme weather went out to get warm sunlight. Those who consisted of rugby players made a plan considering that many people had died and how they could survive until help arrived for a while. What had to be done was to remove all the bodies and other items from inside the plane to make room for the survivors. All the seats and suitcases began to be removed, while checking the contents such as food, drinks, and cigarettes. They also removed the bodies to be collected outside so that a total of 11 people had died. On the second day, Marcelo divided the food equally to each survivor by getting a ration of 1 turkey-flavored biscuit plus sardine topping. That night, they were able to survive in the plane more freely, and they used the empty suitcases as the back cover of the plane. On the third day, Nando, who had fainted when the impact occurred, found his sister in a weak condition and his mother, who had died. Outside, Vito used the sunlight to make drinking water from melted snow while other survivors made signs on the snow, hoping to be seen by the rescue plane. They all tried to scream as hard as they could for help, but the plane kept moving as if it didn't see their presence. The next day, the food supply was almost running out and starting to think about how to be found. Numa suggested going up the cliff to get the battery in the tail of the plane. Numa set off with 3 people up the mountain with makeshift equipment, hoping to find the tail of the plane on the other side of the cliff. When they reached halfway, they finally realized why the previous rescue plane kept moving. Because from half the mountain alone, the wreckage of the plane and the signs made were not visible, making them have to stop the trip and go back down. On the 6th day, the food supply was completely depleted, so they ate anything that could be eaten, such as eating pieces of their own wounds like potato chips. In a desperate condition, Vito then said that Nando had gone crazy because to prevent starvation, he could eat meat from corpses, which turned out to be taken seriously by Gustavo, because if he wanted to survive, being a cannibal was something that had to be done. This crazy plan became a debate between them, while Marcelo and Numa opposed the mukbang event because these corpses were their own friends or relatives. However, Roberto explained the fact that their bodies were getting weaker until the color of their urine had become black. On the 8th day, the condition became more worrying, starting to eat shoelaces until cigarettes were eaten. Nando's sister named Susie was unable to survive and finally died, so Nando took her out and buried her in the snow, and now the number of survivors is only 27 people left. Vito, who was desperate, said that if he died, anyone could eat his body, and was followed by Roberto, who was also willing to be eaten by his body. And finally, those who could not stand it came out one by one from the plane to dig up the bodies buried in the snow, and immediately ate them raw without salt and soy sauce. While survivors who did not agree, including Marcelo and Numa, still survived with an empty stomach. The next day, this madness continued. Vito and his brother, who acted as a butcher, began to cut the second body in a place that was not visible so that the survivors did not know whose meat they were eating, whether it was a friend, sibling, or their own parents. One of the survivors found a suitcase covered in snow. When opened, there was a small radio that could still be turned on. They tried to get a signal by climbing onto the wreckage, while others like Numa and Marcelo, who did not want to become cannibals, could only sit helplessly on the plane. Suddenly, people were heard screaming in disappointment after hearing the radio broadcast that the search for the plane from Uruguay that disappeared in the Andes Mountains would be stopped until the winter was over. This news made everyone frustrated, so Marcelo persuaded the survivors, especially Numa, to eat corpse meat to survive, but Numa still refused to do so and intended to return to look for the tail of the plane with 2 people. And they went up to the marked location until when they reached the top, they did not find the wreckage of the tail of the plane and only found scattered suitcases and several frozen bodies that were thrown when the collision occurred. Towards evening, Maspon suggested to return immediately, but Numa would still look for the battery in the tail of the plane, and without realizing it, snowing began to fall clearly, without any proper preparation. These survivors were trapped in a location, enduring the bone-piercing cold, in the darkness of the night because of the very extreme weather. The next day, the 3 survivors were still able to survive and returned down by sliding using the plane wreckage. Then Nando explained the next plan would be to try to circle the mountain, assuming it was the location of Chile, so it would take a really strong physique, and finally Numa was willing to eat the flesh of his own friend's corpse while crying because it was not roasted first. On the 17th day, the intensity of the snowstorm was getting higher and the survivors were now in better condition. It was seen that they could now joke among themselves. Unbeknownst to them, a vibration indicated an avalanche, and suddenly they were buried in snow in the wreckage of the plane, making the atmosphere chaotic. Some survivors who managed to get out of the snow pile tried to help their friends, some of whom managed to survive, but some did not. Namely, Coco and Marcelo died in the snow pile. The situation got crazier when another landslide hit, and this time they were really trapped because the plane had been completely buried in snow. As a result of this incident, the death increased by 8 people, making them despair. On the 20th day, everyone seemed resigned and didn't know what to do. Numa, who couldn't stand it, tried to make a gap by kicking the plane window, which injured his leg. Because of his efforts, they were finally able to see and enjoy the warmth of the sun again after being buried in the snow for 4 days. Then they tried to remove the snow that had covered the plane. Due to the broken glass, the wound on Numa's leg got worse, making him physically weak. Alvaro advised Numa not to push himself by resting a lot to save energy because the weather could get worse. On the 34th day, the air temperature began to slowly rise, marked by the melting of frozen snow. Unfortunately, Alvaro's condition worsened because his lungs were already filled, and in the end, Alvaro could not be helped. The next day, 4 people, namely Numa, Nando, Roberto, and Tintin, began trying to survey the route. Even though his leg was still injured, Numa still forced himself to join. Now the route will move south towards Argentina, hoping to get a shorter route. This journey is really tiring, making Numa fall and roll because the wound on his leg is getting worse due to infection, so he decided to return while the other survivors continue the journey. Numa arrived on the plane in a weak condition due to a very high fever due to infection and said not to give up because there is definitely hope for life if you want to fight, even if you have to sacrifice your life. Even though sometimes you think about giving up, waiting for death. The next morning, the survivors have returned because they have found the tail of the plane that separated in a different direction and found many suitcases containing food, drinks, and cigarettes. The battery that was sought was finally found in the tail. Their goal back was to take the communication radio to be taken to the tail of the plane to be connected to a battery that was still functioning. Roy tried to connect to the radio, which finally turned on, but the communication signal still could not be obtained. Even though he tried several times, the communication radio still failed completely until the battery ran out, making them frustrated. Unexpectedly, Tintin found some waterproof cloth that could be used to make blankets, and they returned with the bad news that there was no hope of using the communication radio. On the 60th day, after fighting against the infection that spread throughout his body, Numa finally died, leaving a piece of paper containing a message for his colleagues. Now only 16 survivors are still surviving against death. After 2 months without any hope and just waiting for death, now Roberto decided on a one-way trip, which means not returning until he finds help. So Roberto invited Fernando and Tintin, with their physical strength, to travel against the mountain nature to find a way home for all the survivors who had prepared blankets and supplies of corpse meat. The spirit, hopes, and prayers of their colleagues accompanied their departure, who hoped that the 3 of them would get a miracle. This route took a westward direction towards the Chilean route, challenging the ferocity of the beautiful Andes Mountains. They explored the expanse of snow for several days. Who knows how many hundreds of kilometers they had traveled day and night with extreme cold weather that pierced their bones like frozen sardines. These 3 survivors continued to survive through the thick snow that made anyone shudder to feel the spirit of these 3 survivors. Until finally Nando, who was walking in front, arrived at the top of the mountain they climbed, looking at something that didn't make sense, showing a disappointed expression. Roberto and Tintin also showed the same feeling. It turned out that the Andes Mountains were still stretching out like they had no end, making them really resigned and dead-end. But Nando, who could not return, would continue the journey to the valley that was not covered in snow, convinced that there was a way to Chile. In order to save the flesh of the corpses, Tintin had to return to the survivors because the journey was estimated to take 12 days, and the journey continued for days through several vast snowy mountains that seemed endless. Tiredness and despair always loomed to make him give up. Even though Roberto had been sick from eating rotting meat, Nando remembered Numa's words, which made him strong enough to continue the hopes and prayers of the survivors, until finally they went down a rocky valley that was not covered in snow. Both of them took a break while repairing Nando's damaged shoes before continuing the journey. On the 72nd day, they finally arrived in a valley full of green trees with a small river full of fresh water that they had not felt for a long time. A miracle came when Roberto suddenly shouted because he saw mountain police across the river, stopping to see them both. Roberto and Nando immediately jumped happily and waved, asking for help, saying that they were victims of an airplane from Uruguay that disappeared on the border of the Andes Mountains. Hearing this, the mountain police immediately evacuated both of them and reported it to the Chilean National Rescue Team. According to the report, the location of the plane crash had been identified. Meanwhile, Nando and Roberto were enjoying bread and milk for the first time since the accident. Not long after, media reporters began to arrive who wanted to cover the existence of the two heroes and write their very tough story. This coverage reached the survivors via radio, making them very happy that could not be described in words. Nando was taken into the helicopter to show the location of the plane crash, while Roberto buried the remains of the rotting corpse and prayed for it. Upon arrival at the location, 14 people who had been waiting cheered happily when two rescue helicopters arrived. In the end, they were all successfully saved. Tears of joy were seen on the faces of the survivors, because this was like getting a miracle from God and right. These survivors were taken to the Andean mountain range in Chile. Upon arrival at the location, 14 people who had been waiting cheered happily when two rescue helicopters arrived. In the end, they were all successfully saved. Tears of joy were seen on the faces of the survivors, because this was like getting a miracle from God, and right on the 72nd day, they were all successfully evacuated and saved. Then taken to the hospital for treatment, and hundreds of journalists awaited their arrival to cover the curiosity of how they could survive for 2 months. Even some doctors did not expect that they could survive with extreme weather in the Andes Mountains without food. These survivors do not forget the services of survivors who have died willing to sacrifice themselves so that they can survive, because life is a gift that they must use as best they can. Also, the sacrifice of a man named Numa, who continues to provide the spirit of survival. Roberto Canessa continued his education and became a successful motivator and cardiologist. He was also active in politics and was offered to be a presidential candidate for Uruguay, although he ultimately refused. Roberto also told about the cannibalism carried out by survivors in an interview with National Geographic in 2016. According to him, human flesh is similar to the taste of beef, which contains protein and fat. Initially, when you are going to eat it, your mouth is locked, refusing the piece to enter your throat because you will feel very miserable and sad when you do this. Nando Parado has succeeded in becoming a famous motivator, entrepreneur, and TV presenter in Uruguay, and is also the author of the book Miracle in the Andes, 72 Days on the Mountain and My Long Trek Home. When interviewed by The Guardian in 2023, Nando admitted that his first reaction when he woke up was saying how big, very, very big the size of the Andes Mountains was. This is really scary, and how can we get out of here? Nobody will be able to find us here. Nando's experience also made him a consultant for the film Alive, a true story film about a plane that crashed in the Andes Mountains and was released in 1993. After that, Nando continued his father's business, Carlos Paez, actively motivating people by sharing his experiences and successfully becoming a technician and a teacher. Carlos also became part of the author of a book in 2003 entitled After the 10th Day, which became a bestseller. When interviewed by Digital Spy in 2024, the thing he remembered most was when he was rescued by the rescue team. He saw two giant birds that brought freedom to happiness. The message of this film is a real message on a piece of will from a man named Numa Turcati, and the will says, "There is no greater love than sacrificing yourself for a friend." I'm Fox, and thank you for watching.